Well, welcome to our live webinar focused on the IOSH cultural maturity and the IOSH model of safety. My name is Stuart Hughes, President for IOSH, and it's my privilege to be your host for today's session. And before I introduce the panel, I just want to mention that this live session follows two previously recorded sessions that have been delivered in January and February by our very own Angela Gray. Angela is the technical lead at IOSH, and if you haven't seen either of those sessions, don't worry, it doesn't impact today's one. But for reference, our technical support will be in the background. I'll pop some links into those so that you can get hold of them and take a view of both of those recordings at your leisure. I do just want to touch on those two sessions briefly as a bit of a useful recap. So the first session was it really introduced the IOSH model of safety and stripped things back to what I'll call basic principles. And it was aimed at those members that were newer to the profession. And its intent was to help with their understanding, essentially providing a narrative to describe the key points of the model and how it fits with cultural maturity. And then in the second session, Angela kind of progressed that further and introduced some more details around the implementation and leadership. And that was done through 6 characteristics of the model and provided some more practical insights and outcomes of what IOSH practitioners can achieve through the utilization of that. So both of those are available to watch, and the links will appear in the chat box for you. So let's kick on with today's session. It's very much about understanding and applying the principles of cultural maturity, hearing case studies of it in action, and yeah, I'll bring the panel in. So firstly, I've got Sheena O'Brien all the way from South Africa. Hey Sheena. So Sheena is a group risk manager for Sun International, and she is on a mission to make the world a safer and more sustainable place. She's an advocate for health, safety and well-being, is a champion of our future leader community, and also a member of IOSH's council. So welcome Sheena, nice to have you on board. Secondly, we've got Greg Ward, who is IOSH's head of commercial development. Greg leads the commercial development team responsible for maintaining and growing the relationships IOSH has with its 1,700 plus training providers, with the aim of driving IOSH's vision of a safe and healthy world of work. Welcome, Greg. It's always lovely to have you. And finally, we've got Baj Baraj, corporate head of health, safety and security at Alamari Company, all the way from Saudi Arabia. Baj is an enthusiastic and dedicated safety leader, working across a variety of disciplines over the last 36 years. Baj, you don't look old enough. But those include quality assurance, food safety, health and safety, risk management, environment and sustainability. So we'll be welcoming your insights from all of that work. As a transformational leader and advocate for promoting and cultivating safety culture, Baj works with and inspires leaders, managers and workers to achieve sustainable occupational health and safety performance. So welcome panel. Before I jump into the questions, just a little bit of housekeeping for the audience, if I may. Please put questions in the Q&A function. It's the one that's next to the chat box. All the questions in the Q&A function I'll endeavour to answer. If at any point we don't have time to run through all of those, we will collate them and get answers to them and then circulate those to attendees. The session is being recorded, so you don't need to ask that question. It is being recorded and will be readily available on the YouTube channel shortly after we finish today's session. So I'll kick off with a few of my own questions for the panel, and then we will go through into the Q&A. Cool, right. So Sheena, I'm going to start with you, and then I'm going to work my way through from Greg to Baj on question 1. So what I'd like to know is, how does a positive IOSH culture support an organisation in achieving its strategic objectives?
Oh, thanks, Stuart, and hi, everyone. It's great to be here today. So from my perspective, a positive IOSH culture supports an organization because your people are the ones that drive what you need to achieve. So they're the face of the company. They are the first people that your customer interacts with. They are the living, breathing workforce. So if they are not safe, if they are not feeling valued, if they're not feeling supported, that will undoubtedly have an impact on how they perform their jobs, how they execute their tasks, and how that ultimately affects the organization and its ability to achieve its objectives. So if you have a positive OSH culture, I mean, you can put two and two together and see that if you have a reduction in accidents, a reduction in injuries and illnesses, you've got more people that are at work doing what they need to be doing. They'll be happier doing what they need to be doing. And generally, customers will be satisfied, business will be satisfied, and your organization is likely to have a better chance of achieving what it's intending to achieve.
Cool. Thank you, Sheena. And Greg, I'm just going to come to you from your experience of working with a broad range of providers, and from I suppose engaging with the business community. What is it that you're talking to them about in terms of positive OSH culture, helping them achieve their objectives?
I think the challenge is always thinking about what do we really mean by positive, and what is the measurement. That's the challenge around it. I think if you're talking to an organization, a lot of the time it'll be potentially about, the instinctive thing is to talk about the reduction of accidents and look at it from a numerical point of view. The problem about that is that it's very, looking in the rearview mirror. So then to talk about a conversation which is then to challenge the question about whether we're thinking about what is important and what really adds value. So therefore, I think there's a challenge really when we're looking about a positive OSH culture. Well, how is that measured? Does it mean that if we've got low accidents as a consequence, then it's positive with regards to OSH? Much more interested in an organization itself about what its position is and where it sees about OSH and its maturity, in order then to understand, well, actually, how do we look positively? How are we forward looking with regards to OSH? What does that mean in terms of our next 5, 10 years, etc.? And that varies between different organizations that we're looking at. So it's not to try and suggest that the reduction in accidents is not important. It certainly is. But the reality is that in some ways means that you drive yourself into a finite goal, and instead to be thinking about actually something which is much more continuous and that process. So that would be, I think, something that we'll touch on all the way through this conversation.
Great, thank you for the insights, Greg. And Bars, just over to you. Where do you sit with this question of OSH culture and it being positive and helping organisations hit their strategic objectives?
Okay, great. Well, I believe an OSH culture is very important for organisations to meet their strategic intent, whether it be objectives, KPIs. And just going back to really, the definition of a safety culture, in my view, it's individual and group values, attitude, perceptions, competencies, and patterns of behaviour that determine your commitment towards occupational health and safety and its strategic intent. Those organizations that have a positive culture, they instill and cultivate transparency, open honesty, open communication, mutual trust. They have shared visions, beliefs, and perceptions. So, there are many different ways that you could measure, in terms of your safety culture. I normally refer to the Keel Center, but I won't go into too much detail, where there's 5 different levels of maturity index and many different ways of measuring your culture within your organization. But I think it's very important, having that culture is so important, and it's a journey. It takes many, many years.
And if I may, I'm going to just stay with you and just explore that a little bit. So, in the intro, we got a good understanding that you've had a broad and varied career, but have you got any examples that you could share that kind of demonstrate, I suppose, that messaging getting through with developing maturity and its impact on business success?
Okay, great. I mean, I've been in the industry about 39 years now, within the FMCG industry. And, one of the foundations, I believe, in terms of instilling and cultivating a safety culture is having a strong foundation. And what I mean by that in my experience is wherever I've worked in my recent company, I've implemented ISO 45000, which is the international standard for occupational health and safety. That sets the framework and the guidance and governance how organizations can manage occupational health and safety. From my experience, no matter what system, process, procedure you got in place, the success of whatever you're trying to do hinges on the participation and engagement of senior leadership showing active participation in health and safety intervention. Without that leadership buy-in, I believe any process, system or procedure will not be effective. That's my experience, what I found. I think it's so important to get the leadership on board, when you are developing that foundation.
And have you got any perhaps tips for the audience of how to best engage with that senior management to bring them to the party and get them involved?
Okay, I mean, as we all know, ISO 45000 is not a mandatory standard, it's an optional standard for organizations. I mean, one of the things I always say is a structured, consistent, transparent approach to occupational health and safety. So I went to the board and I said to them that if we're really serious about improving sustainable health and safety performance, we need to have a framework, we need to have a structure, we need to be consistent, we need to be transparent. What I said to the board is, I want to implement ISO 45000. I told the CEO and the risk committee, and basically what I said to them is not for the certificate. That is least of the reasons. I'm not interested in having a certificate and putting it on the wall and saying, look how wonderful we are. For me, it's about implementing consistent, transparent, measurable processes that protect our people, our brands, and our reputation. And one of the key things for getting commitment is getting our statement of intent, which is our occupational health and safety policy, getting that endorsed by the CEO, and then cascading that down. I believe if you can get the CEO on board, you'll get everybody on board.
Great, thank you very much. And Sheena, like over to you. Like how I suppose if you got examples that you can share with us that demonstrate the message getting through in terms of importance and significance of OSH.
Absolutely. And I think Baj hit the nail on the head. Leadership buy-in it really starts and ends with them. So from my experience, having your board on your side is a critical element, of course. And being able to have the platform and the access to engage with them and to your senior leadership team so that they have a better understanding of what you're trying to achieve, but also how does what you're trying to achieve through health and safety support them in achieving what they need to do from a business objective point of view. So it's really about trying to connect the dots between the business strategy, the health and safety strategy, the culture, and how that links into the organizational culture that the organization is instilling in its workforce. So definitely leadership, a critical element. But it's also about trying to empower your people. So what we've noticed is that when you give people, if you empower people to take the lead and develop their own sense of ownership when it comes to driving health and safety initiatives, that's where you really begin to see the benefits of what you're trying to do. Because then you have safety champions that are volunteering their time to help you achieve your goals, help you make sure that people are looking after their own health and safety and those of others. You'll see that reflected in your performance, in your metrics, and how you measure and how you report. But fundamentally, it comes down to the people, the leadership, and then how do leadership engage with the staff to make sure that you're getting the same consistent message across.
Yeah, and I think that piece on alignment across the organisation, so that actually the goals of the OSH program and the goals of the organisation are in tune with one another is a vital step and one well worth highlighting there. Greg, as our non-OSH professional joining us from the kind of business insight perspective and slightly different view, I'm curious as to perhaps what messages of success look like or you've heard.
Yeah, well, I'm scribbling down as we go in various different points of time. So I'll do that. I like the identity as the non-OSH person in the room, but my point is I've spent the thick end of 20 years here trying to talk about OSH impacting the bottom line of an organisation, and there's a number of things that have just been made. So let's just take a couple of things from Parge. When you talk about 45,001, I think it's clause 5, which is leadership of that for 45,001. And the challenge is that if we think about systems from a particular system perspective, one of the challenges for business has been, well, where exactly is OSH impacting the bottom line? What does that actually really mean? And the challenge for OSH professionals has been actually being at the top table. That's where, when we talk about the importance of leaders being involved, it's a given, really. What Sheena said actually about empowerment of the workforce, that's the key critical point. That's the goal that you really want to achieve. And how are we doing that? Well, you can only do that if actually an organization and a business and the C-suite of a business sees what that really means, how that really adds value. And so in order to do that, an example about how we've made engagement is to try and talk about when we've worked with Nike and its supply chain in Southeast Asia, is not necessarily to talk about let's reduce accidents. That's not the discussion of that. It's more about how does the leadership organization, how does it set an ethical tone? What does that look like, looking at from things like the OECD principles about good governance? Once we're talking about that level, once we're talking in a language which is on a business-to-business level, and as the OSH professional talking about it from a governance perspective, looking at good corporate governance, the reality is that that's where you've got that introduction to the table, right? Okay, now we're actually talking about a language that we can both understand. Now you can now talk about how we think about things from an OSH perspective. And I think it's taking that route about that discussion that allows you a possibility to do it. So can we think of an example about where that's happened more broadly? If you think about COVID, it gives us a real line where we've thought, right, the OSH professional has been forced into that position because actually we need to think about how do we manage workers, how do we manage their behavior, their commitment, etc., in a very difficult circumstance in terms of health. So getting into that point, it's allowed organizations to think, actually, we haven't really tapped into the OSH professional here, but it's important now post-COVID that we don't sort of redress back into our sort of like more technical roles, much as they are important, but actually is to say, actually, no, we don't want to necessarily identify ourselves as the OSH professional here. We're just leaders. We're just part of the leadership management team to make those kind of changes. So I guess coming all the way around back, these points about the 45,001 is absolutely key critical. But when I was operating or continue to operate in Southeast Asia, they had 45,001. The factories already had this implemented. What was missing is that group level piece around good governance about a corporate level. So that's another part of that discussion.
And I think it brings us back to that alignment piece, isn't it? We're talking about, our leadership, not only bringing us to be part of it, but also empowering the work that we want to do. We're talking about translating that into power at the, at the coal face, for want of a better term, but where the work is actually being done, and galvanizing people to, to talk to us. And then this kind of critical piece on governance as well, and essentially the good governance stretches broader than just occupational safety and health, but that's part of that governance package. I often in presentations will challenge people to name me a story from the Bible, and then once they've given me a name for one, I will ask them what their accident frequency rate was for 2022, and they've got more chance of giving me a story from the Bible than they have of calling a historical figure. And I think the problem we have is we use those figures for decision making rather than the narrative arc of what we're trying to achieve as a profession. So I think when your messaging is landing is when you hear other people using your language to talk about what it is that you're trying to achieve within the organization. Absolutely. And I think that's a really key thing to think about in terms of how would you like somebody else to tell your story, perhaps even when you're no longer with that organization. There's a number of maturity models out there, Greg, and I'm just going to come to you to start with, and then I'll back through to the members of the panel. But I how have you seen the use of that kind of, I suppose, increase or start to be kind of come more commonplace across different organisations, and maybe you could give a couple of examples of organisations that are using the IOSH model.
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to. My first use of the IOSH model of safety was all about back in 2016, 2017. It was incorporated within the IOSH Leading Safely course, and you know, as ever, the eager salesman, I'm looking to try and make a distinction of the way an organisation will work. I work with Royal Mail at quite a long period of time, organisations like Saint-Gobain as well, where what you're really looking at is to say, well, what is that maturity? So essentially, what we're talking about is the distinction between an organisation which is from its OSH maturity, from embryonic to active to proactive to integrated. What are we looking to really try and do that? It might be a question of saying that, I suppose I'll use a good example here of an organisation which had multiple sites. And what we could recognise is that within that organisation, its sites in Scotland were particularly strong. So in terms of its maturity, and therefore the way we analysed that was a really proactive organisation. So what do I mean by proactive? What we're talking about is the fact that actually the responsibility of OSH isn't just the health and safety manager, etc. The integrated or proactive and integrated element of that is that all elements of those businesses, so they did things like their day-to-day health and safety tours. They were looking about how that actually looked and influenced in productivity, about efficiencies, etc. within that organization. So I could see, even as you know, where I was operating there in 2018, 2019, about how that works. It therefore allowed us within that organization to look at comparison about what was going on in England, which was far more regressive. You know, it was almost somewhat embryonic, and gave us a position to then make it a clear comparison. Bringing it up to date, as it were, is that when I joined IOSH 3.5 years ago, the introduction and the better use of the IOSH model of safety more broadly, rather than within a training course, but in actual fact as our model, what we want to do with that is really simply to share that, is so that what we can do is around to organizations, there are loads of models, you know, let's face it, there are lots of models to refer to, so it's not like this is the only thing to do, but at least what we're all trying to do is to drive a safer and healthier world of work. So whichever model you're using, you can relate it. So when we, for example, worked with Nike, the example I gave beforehand, they already had their own model. So their model is like a 5-tiered one referred to as sport, not surprisingly, it's Nike. But what we do is we were able to then overlay the IOSH model of safety on top of that and say, well, actually, rather than your first one, we'll just go from the P to the T element of that and look about what those stages are and really look and align that. So we're looking to try and work and support organizations and to try and, to some extent, speak their language. We recognize what you're trying to do. If you're dealing with a corporate organization or indeed an SME, most of them will have a clear vision about what they're trying to achieve, but how to get to some kind of common point that we say, actually, yeah, we can see where that maps and we understand it, and trying to keep it simple. So so in a nutshell, I dare say probably 7-8 years about working across the IOSH model of safety. The key thing then is to try and share this as much as we can by other people's stories, I guess, is where we want to try and get to. I'll pause on that.
Great, thanks, Greg. And Sheena, just coming to you in terms of you making utilization of maturity models, how have you experienced that within your tenure so far?
So similarly to Greg, there's tons of maturity models. I haven't used the IOSH maturity model, but I did use a different one, particularly looking at risk management maturity. So a bit broader than just looking at safety culture. But the main objective of doing that was to be able to benchmark my organization. So looking at how do we compare to other industry players? How do we compare to best practice when it comes to implementing and rolling out effective risk management? And I mean, the main objective of doing that is so that you have an understanding of where you are in that cycle. You have an understanding of where you need to improve, so you can then look at implementing initiatives to help improve your maturity in the areas that you're struggling in. And it also helps you articulate it a little bit better to leadership so that they can understand, okay, this is how we compare to industry best practice. This is where we need to be going. But part of the challenge then comes in is when they ask you, but why should we be doing more? If we're already doing pretty well, why do we need to reach the gold standard of whatever it is we need to achieve? And that comes down to what Greg was mentioning around linking it back to governance. If you can articulate it to leadership in a way that they understand, it will help them get better oversight of information. It will help them make better decisions because they have a better handle on how things are being managed within the organization. That's really the selling point for it. So for me, using a maturity model was a good way of being able to demonstrate to leadership why we need to change and how we need to do it. And then you can set the measures, you can set the metrics, you can set the KPIs to then report back to leadership to say, okay, this is how we're improving as we go on this journey.
And can I ask you just a kind of follow-on question into that, which I think is an interesting, I suppose, observation. You're kind of marking your own homework in that scenario, aren't you? So how do you, I suppose, overcome how do you get to that really honest position, I suppose? What are the mechanisms that really, you're quite happy to lay everything bare and score yourself objectively, rather than potentially somebody might be keen to make themselves look better to the leadership? So is that something you had to deal with?
Absolutely, and that's where you need to have independent assurance. So you need to either have an internal audit team verify what you're doing against your process, against your framework, or you have an external assurance provider come in and then they use the same sort of maturity model and they assess your performance against that, so that you're not, like you say, marking your own homework. You need somebody to actually give leadership the comfort to know that we are actually doing what we're saying we're doing.
Cool, thank you. That was very off the cuff, but I thought it was an interesting point just to link into. And Baj, just come to you to add to that in terms of your experience with maturity models and their implementation.
Okay, I mean, as Greg and Sheena have said, there's many different models out there that we can use, and I know the IOSH model as well because I had one of my colleagues from Charlie that came over and explained it to us. But what I've been using is the Kiel Center 1999 Maturity Index. That basically has 5 levels of maturity. So level 1 is where you're emerging. You're totally reactive. You've got nothing in place. You've got no HSS competencies, and you've got no dedication in terms of health and safety. Then you've got level 2, which is managing. That's where accident rates are average, safety seen as a business risk, and some resources are allocated. And then you got your level 3, which is involving the organization realizes the importance of frontline staff and the engaged workers, and they develop responsibility and engagement with managers, and they proactively monitor performance. Then you've got level 4, which is cooperating. That's engaging all staff, all managers, all leaders, all workers, where you recognize your commitment and dedication towards safety and you have proactive measures in place. Then you've got level 5, which is continually improving. To be honest, there's very few organizations that get to level 5. Level 5, you've had no fatalities, no work-related fatalities. Number of fires are coming down. Your lost time injury frequency rates coming down. Your lost time injury severity rates are coming down, and you're literally fighting complacency. Now, I don't believe any organization can decide where they are on that maturity index. And the way we've done it is we engaged with a company called TSI. They're part of Camden and Chorleywood in the UK. So what they do is they do a survey and they look at 4 pillars: people, process, proactivity, and purpose. They have a set of questions which they ask leaders, managers, supervisors, and workers. And those questions are all anonymous. You don't have to give your name. You can be open, honest, and transparent. Because if you're going to do this survey, you need to make sure you cultivate trust and honesty if you really want feedback. Now, only those organizations, in my view, that are serious and they really want to hear what the workforce thinks about occupational health and safety, only they will participate in these surveys. And I find that that's probably the best way. And also, like Sheena says, what that does is it also allows you to benchmark against industry best practices. It also helps you benchmark Almarai is a food and distribution company, so I can benchmark myself against Mars, Kraft, Nestle, the big players, and see where you are on that maturity index. I would say I've been in Almarai for 20 years, and I've really been managing occupational health and safety for the last 15 years. I would say we are at level 3. So I would say we're nowhere near level 4 and 5. But the key thing is getting that verified by an external quality assurance, as Sheena mentioned. That really gives you the assurances that, hang on a minute, you're not saying this, your people are saying this. So I think it's really, really important. And then also it gives you scope to progress, because at the end of the maturity index, there's a SWOT analysis. What's your strengths, what's your weaknesses, where are your opportunities, where are your threats, and you can capitalize on those improvements.
Great. And Sheena, I'm just going to come to you, and I'm going to link on from this and just talk about, I suppose, how the role of the OSH professional changes as an organisation moves through their levels of maturity. I know from experience, from probably being at the position where you're very immature and you're constantly firefighting to the changes that happen when your maturity grows and develops. But I just wondered what your experience of that change is, and how, as an OSH professional, you bend and flex with the organisation to serve them best as it progresses.
Absolutely. Yeah, your role definitely does change as your maturity improves. I mean, a lot of the times, and many of the people on the call will probably still be in the phase where you are ensuring compliance. You are making sure that your inspections are done. You're managing the incident response. You're doing all the firefighting, as Stuart mentioned, to try and make sure that people come along this journey with you. But as you mature and as leadership start to understand the value of what you're trying to achieve and how it supports them in executing their strategy, they will start to see you as more of a strategic advisor. They will start to ask you for recommendations, for your opinion on how they should be doing things a bit differently. They will look at you to ask about certain strategic initiatives that they want to roll out, and have we considered the safety of our employees in those scenarios. But I mean, part of that means that you as the OSH professional also need to enhance your own skills, because it's a whole different ballgame when you're engaging with senior leadership compared to engaging with the general employee on the shop floor. So I mean, you need to learn how to effectively engage. You need to learn how to build relationships. You need to have a bit of business acumen. So understanding when they talk about the business and the commercials, you need to understand, how do you fit into that narrative? You need to be able to influence, and that's, I know, something that we generally struggle with, particularly when it comes to driving an OSH culture. But it really comes down to how you engage with that senior leadership team, and the soft skills that you need to be able to do it properly. So really your role does evolve. And I think being able to build the relationships is probably the most important thing.
Great, thank you. And Bosh, just coming to you, you kind of gave us that 15-year viewpoint and where you think your organisation is. Like, what's been the change over 15 years in terms of, for you as an OSH professional?
Okay. Basically, what I found over the sort of 15 years being in Almarai and managing occupational health and safety, what I found is, as we mature, when you're really low down on the maturity index, you're really, like level 1 and level 2, we're just managing accident rates. You're moving from being reactive to proactive. There, I think you have to be a transactional leader, whereby you're hands-on, you're doing day-to-day operations, you're keeping the ship afloat. As you progress to level 3, 4, and 5, where you are maturing in your index and the statistics are getting better, and it's not just about statistics, it's about visible leadership as well, then I think you transition to a transformational role where you're more strategic, a little bit like what Sheena said. I agree with 100%. Then your role becomes more strategic. You become more of a counselor and a coach, and you're creative, you're being innovative, you're looking at the strategy ahead. What's the next thing we're going to do? As you climb up that maturity index, the biggest challenge you also have is sustaining it, because, with the turnover of staff leaving and coming, especially in Saudi Arabia, we've got 36 different nationalities, and the turnover is like 15%. We have a very, very high turnover here. So you're constantly educating, raising awareness. But I think for the OSH profession, for me, certainly, my role, as we've moved up the maturity index, I've moved from transactional to transformational leadership, where I'm creative, innovative, and I'm basically driving the strategic vision for the organization.
Great, thank you, Barge. And Greg, just insights from you in terms of, I suppose, the shift that you might see with some of the OSH professionals that you'll engage with as part of the leadership programs.
I just thought it's interesting when you're talking about the transactional to transformational. It's almost like the exam question that's answered there by Barge, so I can't repeat that. Actually, I'm going to pinch back just to go one step back in terms about doing your own homework. The piece that I talk about with Nike supply chain is that when we looked at the maturity of those initially, we've then allowed them to have what we use as a business assurance tool for the next 2 years for them to self-assess. And the reason why we've taken that kind of risk is in order that it's not just about being audited. We then do an audit after 2 years and then produce a business assurance certification about where they are. But we want a long period of time so they can not just self-reflect, it's whether they continue to do it. I always think if you introduce a program, it's delivered, it's released, but does that become BAU? Does that become simply what they continue to do and then they drift back into where they were? By allowing the leadership team a way in which to self-assess and use a tool to do so, it then tests them to say, do they really know how their organization and what that looks like and what that measurement is? And therefore, the audit bit is to sort of test that longevity of that change. So that was that. Just leading to the actual question that you're asking here, specific on leadership. Okay, so I haven't dodged that one completely. Is to say, actually, what the question here is more around is, it's about what when people identify about the OSH at the top table, and then talking about the OSH leader, it's about being a leader. It's about a conversation that you're having about the issue that's affecting a manufacturing organization, skill shortages, an aging workforce. Where is the contribution that you're making in your conversation there is to understand that. What we're trying to make sure is that actually the OSH professional isn't just sort of like wheeled into a meeting and makes a 10-minute presentation and then wheeled out again. It's about understanding about the whole thing of your organization. If we're actually talking about, what are the key critical issues around the organization itself? You know what I mean? You've heard yourself around, Formula One and the issues of where we are in the races at the moment. You know what I mean? That for your organization is a key thing. What is it for IOSH, for our business? Understand that. That's the key thing that we need to understand and talk about. Now, just referring to an IOSH piece in terms of what we have in Blueprint, Blueprint was redesigned in a way in which that incorporated the focus on actually talking the business language. There are core pieces, there are technical elements of that, but actually, I would really encourage the audience to be looking in terms about their own CPD element of that, about what Blueprint looks like, about that business element of that. Because the conversation fundamentally is, we have to keep a business running. An organization knows the importance about keeping its workforce happy. That's absolutely there. They have to be productive. But what we've got to be able to do is to be doing it in a way in which that makes sense to the whole audience, not necessarily talking about the technicalities of HSG 48 or something like that. That's not it. That's not going to achieve it. But the most effective organizations are doing that, and it has a good leadership team, of which some will have come back from a health and safety background.
Great, thanks, Greg. Look, I'm going to dive into some of the audience questions, and then I might circle back to some of our own, depending on timing. So we've got one here that says, can I please ask how important is the relationship between maturity and safety culture, and how to improve safety culture and make it mirror on the organization's safety maturity? Barge, I'm going to come to you first.
Yeah, so in terms of maturity, as we said, there's many different ways of measuring your maturity index. but I think it's strongly linked to the behaviours, the attitudes, the beliefs of an organisation. And I guess each organisation has to decide what is their strategic intent, what are they trying to achieve, and how are they going to achieve it. You almost need a roadmap, and it needs to be a sustainable roadmap. So, maturity index is absolutely linked to your strategic intent in terms of where you want to go. And personally, I think we need to, I would not want to measure my own organization's strategic culture index. I would want to go to a third party. And like I said, we engaged with a third party and they did our assessments, but it's continual, it's every year. So you can measure the progress every year. It's not just a 1 year program. You do it and then you just forget about it and put it away. It's got to be sustainable. Sustainable health and safety performance comes with continual programs in place.
Great, thank you. Sheena, and over to you with that same question.
Yeah, I agree with Baj there. For me, it's also about using the right model. So if you want to create the link between safety culture and maturity, then use a maturity model that speaks to safety culture. It'll be a bit easier for you to then articulate that relationship to your leadership team and be able to demonstrate how you need to improve your culture. So that would be one element, but then also take it a step further and look at how does that then fit into what the business is trying to achieve. So that when you're trying to convey that message, you're speaking in the language that leadership will understand.
Yeah, and I think they've also got a symbiotic relationship, haven't they? Like if you've got a poor safety culture, you're probably going to be lower down on the maturity level, and the maturity tool might help you influence the culture, and the culture will then influence the kind of maturity as you drive along, and that grows. Greg, I'm going to come to you with a question because it's on the IOSH model of safety. How does the IOSH model of safety measure the success of any cultural maturity initiatives, particularly the tangible indicators?
I'm glad you asked me that one with what feels like a big A-level question on that one, which can be answered in a longer level than 2 minutes. I think that there's let's just take where I would look to think about this is to think about the benefits, about where the output is. So I'm more than happy to, first of all, I'll just say I'm more than happy to have quite a lengthy conversation to answer that question and talk about that from the technical detail of what we've got on the model. But let's just talk about the actual outputs and benefits that we can. What we're looking to try and achieve is to talk about things which are beyond financial. We understand about the financial benefits about doing good OSH and good safety culture and practices. But in actual fact, it's something that Sheena said right at the start of this conversation. It's about empowerment. What we really want to look at is to think about broader things in social sustainability or things around our SDGs, is to say, if we have an empowered workforce, it means it's going to be more productive, it's more motivated. Not only that, but actually if you think about things from not just an individual, but to a family, to a community, then the reality of that, it means it's driven to be innovative, it's driven to educate, and therefore it creates a virtuous circle about what those things are looking for. I tend, perhaps because I'm not an OSH technical person, right? I'm not looking for the technical detail that just says if we can go incrementally from one step to another, that shows better maturity, so therefore it's an improvement. It's something greater. And if I refer back to the supply chain pieces I've talked about in Asia, the thing that made the difference for me was not, and I'll use this stat and then say I've got something better. So working across in Southeast Asia, across more than 1 million workers, the output in reduction was a 47% reduction in accident rates across this group, across a 6.7 billion working hours. When you drill that down into numbers, it's 450 people, it's 450 families, etc. It's a huge number. But what's better than that is that again is sort of like that's a stat. It's an aim to shoot at. What was better was the leadership group of these organizations described themselves as going through a deep mindset change. It means that they owned the importance of what OSH was doing, as opposed to doing it because they were a supply chain to a massive corporate. That was because it means it's permanent. It means as an organization, they change considerably, and they do so then for years to come. That's the importance about what we're trying to do. So really happy to have a sort of technical thing about making those difference in definitions, but I really don't want to miss the fact that actually what's really important about what we're trying to do here is about making social change. This has to be a long-term piece about what we're looking for, because you know, for all of us, I think in this room, is that we've been playing this game for a long time. We've been talking about the same thing, you know, the importance of leadership, the importance of, we've been saying that. It's not necessarily, you know, pushing the rock uphill, but I think there's been a significant change. COVID has driven that change and driven that place. So actually, we've got a real opportunity here to move this forward. But now we're in the what I would say that, you know, the top table. Let's do it by speaking the right language of a business that understands, as opposed to wanting to change their language to something that we're saying. So
I'm glad you linked to the SDGs and kind of, I suppose, the wider social sustainability agenda, because IOSH has done that really impactful report of mapping OSH's impact against the SDGs, and directly or indirectly that covers 13 of the 17 SDGs and influences up to 51 of the targets. So if anybody in the audience hasn't got hold of that report, take a look on the IOSH website and find the report that links to the kind of OSH practice to the Sustainable Development Goals, because that gives you a really solid foundation in terms of having that context to be able to talk that language and to kind of broaden out the impact of and value of the work that we do. There's a couple of questions that reference back to kind of what we spoke about earlier, but I'm going to kind of re-go through it because they've got a slightly different context. So there's a few people in the audience that want to kind of explore, how do you engage with senior leadership and get them to drive buy-in to putting in either, you know, safety measures or programs or even certifications, particularly if they're at the lower end of the maturity model. And I just wondered whether you'd got any advice or guidance. And I'll start with you, Baj, and then I'll come to Sheena.
Okay, I mean, I would advise any organization to always have a foundation. And I always say the foundation is international best practices, which is ISO 45001 2018, Occupational Health Safety Management System. Once you instill that foundation, it's very, very important. And I'll go back to Greg's point, because Greg made a point on leadership and worker involvement and engagement. That is 5.4 in the clause of the ISO standard. What that says is organizations need to ensure leadership and worker consultation and participation occurs consistently. So when we talk about consultation and participation, it's important to know what the difference is. So consultation is getting views of workers and their feedback, and participation is involving them in the joint decision-making process. So this is very, very important. So as I said earlier on, regardless of what system process you have in place, if you don't have leadership, active, visible participation, those interventions will never be successful. And the way I did it is the best way I thought is when you have a statement of intent or your occupational health and safety policy, that should be endorsed by the most senior person in the organization, which is obviously our CEO in our case. So that cascades down to all the different levels. So straight away, you've got that buy-in. And that statement of intent must be very strong and it will be very impactful. So ours, for example, is to proactively prevent work-related injuries and illnesses to our workers and interested parties by providing safe, secure and healthy workplaces. So it's crystal clear in terms of what our intent. Then it also goes on and says all leaders are responsible to cultivate a safety culture to provide safe, secure and healthy workplaces. So that's been endorsed and that helps cascade and give ownership, responsibility and autonomy. I think that's really, really important, because health and safety practitioners alone cannot manage health and safety. The only way you will achieve sustainable, enhanced occupational health and safety performance is if you get in the buy-in from all the other functional divisions. That was my advice, and it's worked for me.
Thanks, Baj. That's really insightful. And Sheena, same question to you.
Yeah, so I'm reading the question that you're referring to, Stuart, and talking around ISO certifications as well and stringent financial resources. When you need to engage with senior management around that stuff, I think what Baj has mentioned is a very important element, because if you don't have that foundation, it makes it very difficult for you to have the conversations with the leadership team. If you're still at a very immature stage in your maturity cycle or culture, obviously compliance should be your primary driving force. So that is something that you can take to leadership and say, this is the bare minimum that we have to do. And if they're not doing that, then that's a bigger challenge for you to deal with. But start with the compliance element, then introduce the foundational elements of your ISO management system. And don't push for a certification immediately, because those things cost a lot of money. Just align to it. Demonstrate how do you align to that ISO standard, that industry best practice that it is that you're trying to align to. And then demonstrate to leadership how can that improve or contribute towards what management are trying to achieve. I think in bigger organizations, it might be a lot easier to link it back to the social element, like Greg was mentioning around sustainability, because you'll probably have ESG departments or departments that do reporting and disclosure into the public domain. So there's a nice story that can be told in terms of how do we sell and promote health and safety and good corporate governance in organizations. I think for smaller companies, that's probably a lot harder of a sell. So starting with the basics and the compliance and the foundation, and then starting to build on those relationships, building the discussion around where we should be, I think is the starting point.
Yeah, I've always found that holding a mirror up to the leadership is a really useful tool, and what I mean by that is really doing that base level work of identifying where you are against, the minimum, like where are we over and under legal compliance, and where do we want to be, what type of organization do we want to be, and being very honest about the size of that journey and the effort that's required to go on it. And I think that's one of the, like, if you have that conversation with the leadership and present them in a very honest way where you are, and ask them, where do they want to get to, because they might not want to reach the gold standard. There may be a level where enough is enough, and then you get that very clear alignment on what the vision is, and get the support and buy-in to help you move in that direction. And I think we've all kind of said it's not an overnight piece, it's a continual effort, and you have to be prepared to put your efforts and energies into that continual work. And there's a really interesting question that's come in on safety culture. So do we agree that safety culture is a subset of organizational culture, and can a safety culture transformation take place if overall organizational culture does not? And I think that's a really interesting question. So Sheena, I'm going to start with you, and then I'll come to Baj and then to Greg.
Yes, is going to be my answer. Safety culture, in my view, is a subset of organizational culture, because your organizational culture is set from the top. That's the tone that leadership are driving in the organization. It's the behaviors that they want the employees to live and breathe every day. Safety culture, in my view, should be integrated into what you're trying to drive from an organizational culture point of view. It shouldn't be isolated. There will be specific objectives you want to achieve in terms of driving a safety culture, but it needs to speak the same language as what is being said from the top. I hope that answers the question.
That's yeah, I think that's a really solid answer. Thank you, Baj.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Sheena that both are very closely integrated. And, a positive culture, as I said earlier on, is a set of behaviors, patterns, attitudes, behaviors, perceptions, and competencies that are displayed not only by the organization, also by individuals as well. And getting those values and making sure that they are the foundation of everything you do. For example, we have a set of Aspire values. So we say within our We have to be, our Aspire values are being adaptable, sharing information, being passionate, being innovative, respecting each other's opinions. Whether you agree with them or don't, you respect people's opinions, and delivering excellence. You know, one of the biggest challenges I've had is over the years since I came to the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, is I've spent pretty much most of my time making sure that health and safety achieves the same strategic importance as finance, HR, operations, you know, any other functions. And that's a big challenge, because we are seen as a cost center, not a profit-making center. And that's always been a challenge, you know. So I think the two are very closely linked. And I think, you know, as we said, making incremental improvements can take many, many years. You know, going from level 2 to 3 to 4 can take many, many years, 5 to 10 years. But without the leadership commitment, it's almost impossible.
Thank you, Baj. And Greg, just any final thoughts on that topic?
Okay, so I've taken so many notes on here. It's just I'm trying to summarize. So let's just say one thing is that we refer to safety culture, but we talk about OSH, and we don't use health. We don't talk about health in the same context as we do with safety, and that's despite the fact that the question about well-being, about mental health, etc., is taking a more and more significant point, and in particular driven by COVID. Therefore, it's a question of whether it's an OSH culture as opposed to a safety culture. The connotation is that safety is negative and is about reducing accidents, and therefore is pulling you back in that way, as opposed to being proactive. Your question was, is it a subset of the organisation? And therefore it must be a subset of that, as opposed to an independent, for the same reasons that there isn't a sales culture and a logistics culture, etc. But I do think that there's almost an element, perhaps by the way in which OSH is developed, and it's all in an element of isolation. Actually, you can have a good, strong safety culture and approach for safety, whereas the organization doesn't necessarily understand it because of the different language it's taking. So there can be an element of independency, but if it's going to drive change, real change, you know, the empowerment of workers, then it has to be one and the same thing.
Yeah, and I think there's a really interesting point there. So, you know, health is ultimately the foundation that everything else is built upon. And I think it's for too long a time probably been the ugly sister to safety. And if you look at the statistics, we lose more people due to exposure to work-related disease or ill health. That is impacting more people in terms of loss of ability to work or loss of life. And I think that balance of making sure that health is fundamentally included within health and safety is critical for us. And I think it's we have to understand that there's a complex amount of things that have to happen to drive and deliver safer outcomes, and the assessment of the maturity of an organization is one tool within many toolkits to help people be able to decipher where they are today and where they want to be tomorrow and how to work towards that. I'm just conscious of time, so I don't think we're going to get to all of the questions in the Q&A. So what I'm just going to do is give each of you 30 seconds just to give any final thought or summary. So yeah, Sheena, I will start with you.
Thanks. Yeah, so I think for me, definitely, if you want to try and improve a safety culture within your organization, using a maturity tool is a good start, because it allows you to set that benchmark to identify how your organization, what that safety climate is, how your employees perceive safety, how the leaders perceive safety, and then you can benchmark yourself against that maturity model or against best practice, whichever tool it is that you use. And then you can start to put together that program and those initiatives and those timelines and those KPIs that you're going to measure your performance against. And then you can have the conversation with leadership. But to start without any information, I think, is what a lot of people generally tend to do, and then they struggle to get the message across the line. So it is a good tool for you to use as a starting point to get that message to the leadership team. So that's my 30 seconds. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Baj.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Yeah, I agree with Sheena. I think that for me, the foundation is anybody who wants to improve sustainable, enhanced occupational health and safety performance. Start with the basic foundation, which is the international best practice ISO 45000. Closely linked to that is the maturity index. They both dovetail together. So having a model and using a model to drive sustainable performance is also a very good idea as well. And you know, it's one good way of, as Sheena said earlier on, you don't need to go for certification for 45,000. Don't do it for the certificate. Just do it to comply. You know, people don't need to go for certification. Organization can check their compliance against 45,000 because it shows you a structured approach. So don't go for certification. Just implement it and then get that maturity index being built up. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. Greg?
Very quickly, I'd just like to say we'd like to contact us and tell your story. What I want us to do is I think one of the challenges for OSH is that we talk to each other about OSH. What we want to do is to get your story for your businesses into the IOSH magazine. So reach out either to myself, to Angela Gray, who writes our pieces, and then we can tell that story out there. Let's share this with other people about what excellence looks like and how we drive change through the story of each other.
Great, really nice call to action at the end there, Greg. I'd just like to express my gratitude and thanks to Sheena, Baj and Greg for joining us. For everybody that's been on the call, I hope you found it a really useful session. I think really key for me here, kind of good governance, leadership buy-in, employee empowerment, and that linking the story to the wider social sustainability piece. Yeah, thank you very much. I really enjoyed that session. My head's fizzing with things to think about, and yeah, I wish you all a good rest of the day wherever you are in the world. Thank you very much for joining us, and yeah, the recording of this will be up in the not too distant future. So if you want to play it back or pass it on to anybody else, check out the IOSH YouTube channel and you'll be able to do so. That's it from me. Thank you very much again to our panelists, and I hope to see you all soon.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank
Have
you.
a wonderful day.